Hare Krishna. Welcome, devotees, to the morning Srimad Bhagavatam class. Today we will be reading from second canto, ninth chapter, verse number 1, beginning the ninth chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam. So let me begin with my prayers. Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadadi Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Gurau Shriyotapada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari वृषभानुसुते देवी प्रणमामि हरिप्रिये वाञ्छकल्पतरुभयश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्य एव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे नमा ओम विष्णुपादाय कृष्ण पृष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमती भक्ति वेदांता स्वामी नीति नामिने नमस्ते सारस्वती देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्य देशे तारिणे. I'll share my screen. So we will read the verse, the synonyms, translation, and purport, and then we will briefly discuss what Srila Prabhupada is writing. And so, okay. Shri Shuka Vacha Atma Mayamrite Rajan Parasyanubhavatmanaha Nagat Na Ghate Tartha Sambandha Swapna Drashtur Ivanjasa. Once again, Shri Shuka Vacha Atma Mayamrite Rajan Parasyanubhavatmanaha Na Ghate Tartha Sambandha Swapna Drishtur Ivanjasa. Synonyms or word-to-word meanings. Sri Shuka Vacha, Sri Shukadev Goswami said, Atma, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Mayam, energy, Rite, without, Rajan, O King, Parasya, of the pure soul, Anubhava, Atmana, of the purely conscious, Na, never, Ghatena, it can so happen, Artha, meaning, Sambandha, relation with the material body, Swapna, dream, Drishtu, of the seer, Eva, like, Anjasa, completely. Translation by His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada. Sri Shukadev Goswami said, O King, unless one is influenced by the energy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, there is no meaning to the relationship of the pure soul in pure consciousness with the material body. That relationship is just like a dreamer's seeing his own body working. Purport. Maharaj Parikshit's question as to how a living entity began his material life, although he is apart from the material body and mind, is perfectly answered. The spirit soul is distinct from the material conception of his life, but he is absorbed in such a material conception because of being influenced by the external energy of the Lord called Atma Maya. This has already been explained in the first canto in connection with Vyasadev's realization of the Supreme Lord and his external energy. The external energy is controlled by the Lord, and the living entities are controlled by the external energy, by the will of the Lord. Therefore, although The living entity is purely conscious in his pure state. He is subordinate to the will of the Lord in being influenced by the external energy of the Lord. In Bhagavad Gita 15.15, also the same thing is confirmed. The Lord is present within the heart of every living entity, and all the living entities' consciousness and forgetfulness are influenced by the Lord. Now, the next question automatically made will be why the Lord influences the living entity to such consciousness and forgetfulness. The answer is that the Lord clearly wishes that every living entity be in his pure consciousness as a part and parcel of the Lord, and thus be engaged in the loving service of the Lord as he is constitutionally made. But because the living entity is partially independent also, he may not be willing to serve the Lord, but may try to become as independent as the Lord is. All the non-devotee living entities are desirous of becoming equally as powerful as the Lord, although they are not fit to become so. The living entities are illusioned by the will of the Lord because they wanted to become like him. Like a person who thinks of becoming a king without possessing the necessary qualification. When the living entity desires to become the Lord himself, he is put in a condition of dreaming like he is a king. Therefore, the first sinful activity, sorry, therefore, the first sinful will of the living entity is to become the Lord, and the consequent will of the Lord is that the living entity forget his factual life and thus dream of a land of utopia where he may become one like the Lord. The child cries to have the moon from the mother, and the mother gives the child a mirror to satisfy the crying and disturbing child with the reflection of the moon. Similarly, the crying child of the Lord is given over to the reflection, the material world, to lord it over as karmi and give this up in frustration to become one with the Lord. Both these stages are dreaming illusions only. There is no necessity of tracing out the history of when the living entity desired this. But the fact is that as soon as he desired it, he was put under the control of Atma Maya by the direction of the Lord. Therefore, the living entity in his material condition is dreaming falsely that this is mine and this is I. The dream is that the conditioned soul thinks of his material body as I, or falsely thinks that he is the Lord and that everything in connection with that material body is mine. Thus, only in dream does the misconception of I and mine persist life after life. This continues life after life as long as the living entity is not purely conscious of his identity as the subordinate part and parcel of the Lord. In his pure consciousness, however, there is no such misconceived dream. And in that pure conscious state, the living entity does not forget that he is never the Lord, but that he is eternally the servitor of the Lord in transcendental love. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Gyananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam. I was born in the darkest ignorance, and my spiritual master opened my eyes with the torch of knowledge. I offer my respectful obeisances unto him. When will Srila Rupa Goswami Prabhupada, who has established within this material world the mission to fulfill the desire of Lord Chaitanya, give me shelter under his lotus feet? Okay, so we will now discuss the verse and the purport. So this is in relationship with the question that, sorry, that Parikshit Maharaj asks. And Parikshit Maharaj, in the previous chapter, he asked the question, like one of the question 287, I think, was that when or how a living entity began his material life, a valid question. And this question has Parikshit Maharaj, being a very intelligent person, uh, he is asking this question, and we see that this question is repeatedly asked even today. In fact, this question was so important and so controversial that it even went to GBC to be resolved. And here we have the opportunity to hear directly from Shukadev Goswami what the answer is to that particular question. So we'll see that Shukadev Goswami is saying that, O king, unless one is influenced by the energy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, there is no meaning to the relationship of the pure soul in pure consciousness with the material body. So Shukadev Goswami is saying that the influence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, or the material energy, is the one that is causing the purely conscious soul to be in the material world because of the influence. The relationship is just like a dreamer seeing his own body working. And now we see in the purport, Srila Prabhupada has 3 paragraphs. So the first paragraph is covering how a living entity began his material life. That's Maharaj's Parikshit's question also. And in the second paragraph, Srila Prabhupada covers the why the Lord influences the living entity to such consciousness and forgetfulness. He also covers the when question. When did this happen? Because that's also one of the question we have, or many devotees have, like, when did this begin? So he covers that also. And in the last paragraph, he says that in his pure consciousness, meaning that when the living entity is not covered by material consciousness, there is no such misconceived dream. And in that pure conscious state, the living entity does not forget that he is never the Lord, but that he is eternally the servitor of the Lord in transcendental love. So we will discuss this in these 3 stages also, like Prabhupada is mentioning in the purport, how, why, and when. So I'll stop sharing. So Srila Prabhupada begins with how. So how did the living entity began his material life? Now, that if we look at the question, and that question is raised by Maharaj Parikshit, who is a very intelligent being. I mean, he's extremely intelligent. He's putting these questions to Shukadev Goswami, and Shukadev Goswami is answering. And Srila Prabhupada here is writing that the spirit soul is distinct from the material conception of his life, but he is absorbed in such a material conception because of being influenced by the external energy of the Lord called Atma Maya. So the living entity is influenced by the external energy of the Lord. Now, this is also further explained by Srila Prabhupada in Chaitanya Charitamrita Adi Lila 7.114. He breaks this down, the external energy of the Lord, in 2, which is the Prakshepatmika Shakti and Avarnatmika Shakti. So Prakshepatmika Shakti is the power to throw the living entity into the material existence. And Avarnatmika Shakti is the power to cover the knowledge of the living entity. Now, usually for me, examples work best. And to understand these two Shaktis, we can understand, for example, we go to a movie theater to watch a movie. What happens? First of all, we have a desire to go and watch the movie. So we go watch the movie, enter the theater, and we settle down, and slowly the lights turn dim, and then the lights turn off, and then the bright screen comes up. So that can be thought of as the power to throw the living entity into the material existence, or the prakshetpatmika Shakti. So the living entity, the person has gone into the theater, and the conditions have become congenial for the show to begin. What happens next is the Avarnatmika Shakti, which is power to cover the knowledge of the living entity. And then the show starts with bright light in front of us in the movie. There are things happening, and the person in the movie, he cries when somebody's sad scenes happen, becomes really happy when good things happen, becomes really passionate when there's fighting and things like that, completely absorbed in the movie. Now, this is not just exactly like the, I mean, yes, it's we can think of it like this, but also take it one step further. I don't know if everyone, probably devotees don't watch movie, but I had watched a movie many years back with my son, something, I forgot the title, but Narnia or something like that, where the person actually begins the movie, but actually the person begins to take part in the movie and begins to go and navigate within the movie and whatever he desires, and things become real for him, for the person, or not just one person, but multiple. There was a group of people or kids actually. So that's like us. That's what is happening to us also, that the knowledge has been covered. And Prabhupada gives the example here of, he talks Bhagavad Gita 15.15, which is the famous verse, Sarvasya chaham riddhi sannivishto mattasmiti jnanam apohanam cha vedaishta sarva aham eva vedya vedantakrit vedavid eva chaham. So Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, I am seated in everyone's heart, and from me comes remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness. By all the Vedas, I am to be known. Indeed, I am the compiler of Vedanta, and I am the knower of the Vedas. So Krishna, actually, the Lord has facilitated the forgetfulness, apohanam cha. So he facilitates the forgetfulness, because of which the living entity enters the material world and begins engaging in material activities. Just like in that movie, facilitation has been there, and now things happen, and in control of the movie, the emotions are happening and getting involved, and this and that all happening. So Krishna is facilitating that. Now Prabhupada begins the next paragraph saying, now the next question automatically made will be why the Lord influences the living entity to such consciousness and forgetfulness. So that's the natural question. Why? So we'll cover this, the why part. And Prabhupada says here that the living entity is originally pure consciousness. So pure consciousness, in the pure consciousness, there is no need to come and get involved in the material energy or in the material world. But the consciousness got corrupted somehow. How did that get corrupt? Krishna also talks about in the Bhagavad Gita, Icha and Dvesha, I think in the 7th chapter. Icha, Dvesha, Samanmitaha. I don't remember the exact words, but desire and enviousness. These are the two reasons because of which the living entity desires to enjoy the material world or wants to become one with the Lord, like Prabhupada talks here, or wants to become as powerful as the Lord. We can understand that also. For example, when we are working in our workplace, in a company somewhere, it's a natural tendency for us to become the boss. We are working under a boss or multiple bosses, and the desire is to become the boss. Why? Because I don't want to be bossed over. I want to be the controller. I want to do things like I want. So Prabhupada talks about this later on in the paragraph also, the living entities and the concept of I, me, mine, etc. So that same thing happens to the living entity in the spiritual world, in the pure consciousness. That desire arises that I want to become the Lord or I want to become the controller. Now, that question is asked sometimes in my discussion groups. Somebody had asked, like, is the living entity not aware? Is the living entity not conscious of the consequences? And I looked up and researched, and the answer made sense. The living entity in its pure conscious state is Sat Chit Ananda. Because the living entity is part and parcel of the Lord is Sat Chit Ananda. The living entity is also is Sat Chit Ananda. And the component of Chit, which is the knowledge, is there in the living entity. Yet, so yes, the living entity is aware of the consequences. Yet, because of the free will of the living entity desires to be independent, which is what Prabhupada mentions here. But because the living entity is partially independent also, he may not be willing to serve the Lord, but may try to become as independent as the Lord is. So that is the how, and we can also understand through our examples here. For example, I'm living here in Chicago, nicely in the mode of either goodness, passion, something like that. And then I hear from my friends and some persons that there is a city called Las Vegas. Now we know that's normally called as the Sin City. And there are these things happening, which is all the illicit things happening there, gambling and intoxication, and the living entity, the person may think, oh, it's so nice there, I want to go there. So, and then because that happens, he works towards that, and then he ends up there. So that's the free will of the person. Similarly, the living entity, having the knowledge of what's there, still has the desire, and then the Lord facilitates that. The Lord facilitates the forgetfulness of the original consciousness, as mentioned in the 15.15 Bhagavad Gita, and puts the living entity in the material world. Prabhupada also uses that example of a child wanting the moon, and what does the mother do? Mother says that, well, you cannot have the moon, but since you are so adamant, here's the moon, and presents the mirror in front of him. The mirror the moon seems now reachable, although it's an illusion, it's a reflection. Another example Prabhupada gives is that someone wants to become a king without possessing the necessary qualifications. So how does he become a king? And he can become a king in the dream. So dream also, some people will ask that, okay, so this material life, is it only a dream? Well, the material life is as real as the dream is real. So is the dream real? Well, dream is real, meaning that in the dream, I see myself doing something. I see that in the dream, I'm attacked by a tiger. In this condition, I'm a king and I'm enjoying this and I'm doing this and that. While in the dream, everything is real. The emotions are real. The visions that we see are real thing, because ordinarily we need eyes, external eyes to see. But in a dream, our eyes are closed, yet we are seeing everything. And the reactions also happen. Prabhupada often talks about this, that when a tiger comes, the living entity is so emotionally disturbed that the dream may break. But the body is going through those symptoms. So in one sense, even though a dream is non-real, when it is happening, it is still real. So similarly, this material life, while we are in it, it is real. Things are happening to us. Things are there are consequences. The karma are acting. We do something, we get back, all etc. So Shukadev Goswami explains that the material life is like a dream. That relationship is just like a dreamer seeing his own body working. And finally, Prabhupada talks about the when question. When did this happen? Now, this is like, okay, I fell into a well and I'm exhausted. I'm trying to get out of the well. And then suddenly someone comes and brings a rope and throws the rope. And then I start asking, when did I fall here? Why did I fall? Will this, and then I try to analyze the rope. Will this rope really take me out? What is this rope made of? What am I supposed to do with this rope? The person above says that don't worry about all that. Just hold the rope and come out. But I try to ask these questions. So it's similar here. The living entity is in this situation and trying to find out when this happened. And now this when question is a natural question that comes for everyone. So we understand that the event did happen. The event when we came from the spiritual world to the material world, that particular event occurred. But the time is different. The time is not the same context as we understand time here. And that's why to think about the when in terms of time in the current time that we understand is not relevant. It cannot be understood that way. Because like Prabhupada says, time exists in the spiritual world also, but it is conspicuous by its absence. So that's why, and logically also it does not make sense. Like when is a very irrelevant question. Yes, it happened and there must be some explanation of that time, and we will probably understand when we get back to the spiritual world in those time concept of the spiritual world. But right now the main intelligence is to get out. Why worry about the time? And lastly, in the end, Srila Prabhupada ends, in his pure consciousness, however, there is no such misconceived dream. And in that pure conscious state, the living entity does not forget that he is never the Lord, but that he is eternally the servitor of the Lord in transcendental love. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu also, Bhakti Vinod Thakur has a song, Jiva Jago, Gaura Chanda. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is also asking that Jiva Jago means get up, wake up from this dreaming state, wake up, wake up. This waking up state is also mentioned in other religions and other practices, including Buddhism and other religions. Everyone talks about this. Now, the only difference is that after waking up, what do we do? That's where the differences begin. But everyone acknowledges that the living entity is sleeping or not in a wakeful state, and that we need to wake up. So quickly I'll summarize. I'm being pinged my team. So this is a verse which is an answer by Shukadev Goswami to Parikshit Maharaj on his question of how the living entity began his material life. And Srila Prabhupada talks in the purport in 3 paragraphs. He begins with the how question, how the living entity began his life. We talked about the how, and it's mentioned that it is by Lord's external energy, Atma Maya, and we talked about that energy could be further divided or understood in terms of Prakshepatmika Shakti, or the power to throw living entity into the material existence, and Avarnatmika Shakti, or the power to cover the knowledge of the living entity. And then the next obvious question is the why, which Prabhupada explains in the next paragraph. And we talked that it is the free will, misuse of the free will of the living entity, which causes the living entity to come. It's not the Lord's desire, it's not Krishna's desire, but it is our own desire, because of which we come into the material world. And then the next question is when. We talked about the irrelevance of that question, when. Why should an intelligent person would really want to get out after understanding the purpose and the question, rather than as getting entangled in the question of when. And finally, in the pure conscious state, such misconceived dream and the forgetfulness is removed, and the living entity is constituted or put back into the transcendental constitutional position or stage. So I'll stop here, and if there's any question, please, or discussion for just a couple minutes. Otherwise, we can stop here.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Guru Maharaj and Srila Prabhupada.
Hare Krishna.
Very nice class.
Prabhu. Thank you, Prabhu. Hare Krishna. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.
Jai. I know you're getting pinged by your team, so I don't want this to be a long question, a long drawn-out answer, but just a clarifying question. You brought up a very interesting point, by referring to 15:15, where the Lord facilitates remembrance and how we remember and how we acquire knowledge, right?
Forgetfulness and remembrance, yes.
Yeah. So a clarifying question is, okay, so if he is being so, merciful, which he is, in terms of, making the jiva forget everything and gives him a new life, a new body, right, in his new life, how come his karma is also not zeroed out? His karma is, as we study from the scriptures and hear from the acharyas, is this karma coming from previous lives, millions of lifetimes, that accumulates and then comes in and manifests itself. Now, we know that of the 5 topics in the Bhagavad Gita, karma is the only one which is temporary, practically, right? Yeah. All the other ones are eternal.
Eternal, yeah.
So why is it? How do we explain why karma is also not zeroed out? Just like he's given us forgetfulness so kindly, because if we remember our previous lives and our previous relatives and parents and everything else that happened, obviously we're going to be in a terrifying situation. So similarly, why is karma not zeroed out?
So I'm sure you know the answer to this, Prabhu, but I'll try my best. So here in 15.15, Krishna says that it's not just apohanam, but he also gives matta smriti and jnanam. So he gives the remembrance and the knowledge also. So because the living entity desired to use his free will and come here, he gave apohanam. And then when the living entity understands, comes to that self-realization position, he gives Jnanam and Smritir. And once that Jnanam and Smritir is there, in 18th chapter, Krishna says that Mokshasmi Masucha, I take away all your karma. Don't worry about your zeroing out your karma. Simply surrender to me, and you'll come back to me. That's my understanding, Prabhu.
So you're saying by default the karma follows us, but then the good part is that if we take to Krishna consciousness, Krishna is kind enough to take away all of those karmic reactions by through our surrender to him.
Yeah, by our own efforts, my understanding is we can never get rid of the karma. There'll always be something or other, positive, negative, always happening. But Krishna mercifully says that famous verse 18.66 or 65, that he takes away the karma.
Yeah. Thank you, Prabhu. Definitely food for thought.
Thank you, Prabhu. Like I said, I'm sure you knew the you know the answer, but thank you very much.
Hare Krishna.
We'll end here. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyev cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha.